Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Freethought Steve. I consider myself a freedom fighter against the empire of delusion. Religion and its delusional worldview is a colonial enterprise attempting to colonize consciousnesses all over the world. And it's been so successful that the delusional empire of religion has successfully colonized virtually all human consciousnesses for thousands of years. And now finally, some of us are beginning to rise up as freedom fighters on behalf of realism, on behalf of trying to make the world safe, to be realistic and not believe in a bunch of superstitious nonsense. Last time I tried to explain to you the fundamental principle of realistic thinking, which is that no statement can ever be considered true unless we have checked that statement against reality, against the reality that we can observe, to make sure that that statement accurately describes the aspect of reality that the statement is purporting to describe. And all statements that purport to describe the true condition of non-observable, so-called spiritual entities of any sort, all such statements are not verifiable. They cannot be validated because we cannot observe the entity that those statements are about. Any statement about any God, any deity, any spirit whatsoever that we cannot observe, those statements are nothing but imaginative speculations about these unobserved supposed spiritual beings. And we should never treat any of those statements as being a valid truth claim. They are all false truth claims because none of them can be checked for accuracy. So all metaphysical statements are invalid statements, and all claims to know anything about the metaphysical, the beyond the physical, the non-physical, all claims to know about the non-physical are illegitimate claims. They are not true claims. You can't say, well, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. Therefore, it's legitimate for me to believe sincerely as true the fact that God exists. Because you can't prove that God doesn't exist, therefore it's legitimate for me to believe as true that God does exist. And that's wrong. That's a false line of reasoning. Because the only time it's legitimate to believe that it's actually really true that God exists is if you can prove that it's true that God exists and validate that idea against observed reality. That's the only time that it would be legitimate to believe that God exists as a fact and to say, yes, I believe that so much that I'm going to stake my life on it. And worse yet, I'm going to stake other people's lives on it if they don't agree with me in my delusion, which is what the Christian church has historically done throughout the centuries. The Catholic Church, when it was the only church in Europe, it was a capital crime to not believe the official dogma of the Catholic Church. And they would burn you at the stake if you came right out and said, no, I don't believe in God. I don't believe Jesus was the Son of God and all that stuff. In fact, they would burn you at the stake for saying, well, I believe that there's God, but I don't believe Jesus was his son. Burn you at the stake. Now, you're getting burned at the stake for not believing ideas that cannot be proven to be true. Those ideas have never been validated by comparing them with reality, with God and Jesus, because nobody can see God or Jesus because they are figments of the human imagination. There was a historical Jesus once, But the mythical Jesus that has been created by the Christian religion is a totally imaginary picture, a totally imaginary being who supposedly lives in heaven along with God and the angels and all that. God, the angels, the devil, demons, all of these, being non-physical, are completely imaginary ideas. People are making up speculations about the unknowable and calling those speculations true, and then persecuting other people if they don't agree with that set of completely imaginary speculations about that which cannot be known. The only true thing we can say about the non-physical, the unobservable, the only true thing we can say about it is that we know nothing about it, and leave it at that. I don't know anything about it, you don't know anything about it, they don't know anything about it. Nobody knows anything about that which cannot be observed or measured scientifically, that which cannot be proved to exist in some way. Anything that cannot be proved to exist, we know nothing about. And for tens of thousands of years, human beings have committed the original sin of believing that the imaginary is real. And they have started to let the imaginary run their life. And for many people, the imaginary becomes more real than reality, and they're willing to die for the imaginary, which is the height of stupidity and absurdity. But a delusional worldview, which depends on everybody believing that the imaginary is real, praises these people who are stupid enough to die for the imaginary, praises them as heroes. And people are praised for making what they call a faith decision, for deciding deliberately to believe in something for which there is no evidence. And you say, I know there's no evidence for it, but I'm going to believe it anyway. That amounts to saying, I'm going to believe this, not because it's true, but because I want to believe it. And I want to believe it either because it makes me safe, makes me feel safe to believe it, or because it helps me belong to a community of other people who are similarly delusional and also believe that the imaginary is real. And that feeling of belonging to the community and the feeling of having imaginary protection from the imaginary beings makes me feel so good emotionally that I'm willing to adopt a delusional worldview as my way of looking at the world. And I will hang out only with other people who share that delusional worldview. And so the delusional worldview of Christianity and all other religions, these delusional worldviews are like a virus, a contagious virus that gets passed from one person to another until it becomes a pandemic. And eventually everybody in the world is infected with it, and it becomes normal to think of being infected with delusional thinking as the right way to be. Delusionism starts being seen as realism, but it's not. It's very, very different. Now, all of us who had Christian upbringings, as I did, I had a minister as a father, a Presbyterian fundamentalist minister as a father. And so all of us who shared that kind of Christian upbringing, we were all victims of the empire of delusion. My father was an imperialist of consciousness, and he built up his self-worth because he had so little self-worth because he was filled with masturbation guilt and felt always like a poor, miserable sinner. The only way he could build up his self-esteem was to say, oh, well, I'm working for God, and if I can capture another soul for God, then that makes me a good person. So his whole reason for being in life, his whole meaning for life, was to be an imperialist on behalf of a delusional worldview. And every consciousness that he believed he could convert to believing in this delusional worldview made him feel like a big person. Oh, I've done something good. God is proud of me because I've been able to convert this person to this particular delusional view of reality. And so I was his primary victim, and you were all probably victims of your family doing this. Now, I consider this cognitive emotional child molestation. And we were all victims of Christian or Islamic or Hindu or Jewish cognitive emotional child molestation. Cognitive refers to our intellect. Our intellect was being violated and molested with delusional ideas about reality that were actually false ideas that we were told were true ideas. And so our intellect was being polluted, infected by delusional ideas. And those delusional ideas placed us under a certain amount of emotional stress because we always had to try to be perfect for God. Because God is perfect, because God is imaginary. It's easy for an imaginary being to be perfect. So human beings always can imagine God as being perfect, and God has no trouble being perfect because God is imaginary. We human beings, on the other hand, are biological organisms, and we have biological drives built into our nervous system, among which is our sex drive. And unfortunately, Judaism and Christianity and Islam really are sex-negative religions in many ways. They don't accept the full range, the full spectrum of the natural human sex drive. And that's reality. That's where we want to start from as we grow up, recognizing that we all have a sex drive that comes in on full on, online, and fully operative when we hit puberty. And then being sexually interested in other human beings becomes one of the most important and emotionally satisfying things that we experience. We start having crushes on people, and we feel glows of emotional satisfaction, pleasure, euphoria when we think about the person we have a crush on. And if we learn to masturbate, then we learn to have delightful sexual experiences and wonderfully pleasurable orgasms from masturbation. And most of us are not in a position to have intercourse, unfortunately, when we're going through our teen years. Many teens do have intercourse, but it's always illicit. It's always has to be done secretively, and oftentimes that makes it unsafe, and people get pregnant and people get STDs. We don't have a regular way of satisfying our sex drive during our teen years, which was actually something that was done in certain sex-positive cultures. In India, there was a culture, the Murya, who had dormitories where the young people stayed. They moved in at the age of 5, 6, 7, whatever, and so they slept every night in the dormitory until they got married. And this kept them out of the house so their parents could have sex without worrying about the kids being around, because there wasn't much privacy in the kind of houses that they lived in. These were fairly simple tribal people. They were agricultural people, and they didn't build elaborate houses. So by the time the kids were old enough to know what sex was about, they had moved over to the young people's communal dormitory, and they lived there. And eventually they got paired up with another young person in the dormitory, and they started having sex with them. And so they were provided a safe place, a safe partner to have sex with when their natural sex drive kicked in, and they learned how to have natural sexual intercourse during this critical period of sexual learning that takes place right after puberty. Those years are the years in which we learn our sexual habits very deeply. And so it would be actually much healthier for us all to learn intercourse at that time of our lives. But instead we learn masturbation which is okay. That's our safest option at this point when we live in a society where they don't have youth dormitories where young people can safely learn to have sex. For us, masturbation is the best option during our teen years because we won't catch STDs from it and we won't get pregnant. But the point is that we need to learn to masturbate well. We need to learn to have excellence in masturbation so that we can satisfy our natural biological sex drive as well as possible with our masturbation until such time as we find a safe, mature sexual partner that we can have intercourse with and other sexual activities with, whom we know has been just as responsible as we ourselves have been about protecting our sexual health. But in the meantime, we want to be able to masturbate, but we want to be able to masturbate really well. We want to be able to masturbate and totally satisfy our sex drive. And fortunately, we can do that, but we have to have a good conscience if we're going to do that. And that's where religion screws us up by making us have a bad conscience about our sexual activity during our teenage years, even masturbation, which is an activity that harms no one else, that is good for us because it satisfies our own sex drive, it gives us pleasure, and masturbation prevents us from needing to seek unsafe sex with casual sex partners or whoever we happen to be able to find that's willing to have sex with us. This is deprivation motivation. And that leads to problems because it leads to unsafe sex. But if we are able to satisfy our own sex drive very thoroughly and very well with masturbation, then we are sexually autonomous. We're taking care of our own sex needs. We don't need to rely on anybody else. And so it's a good thing if we can do that. But unfortunately, Christianity and the other religions have generally taken a negative attitude toward masturbation and tried to make us feel that masturbation is something terrible and sinful and bad. And every time we even have sexual thoughts, we're supposed to be sinful in the eyes of these religions. Now, what are these religions saying? They're saying that God, who supposedly created the universe and created us, but who is actually an imaginary being, we have no idea. The universe may have completely come into being without any conscious intelligence behind it whatsoever. It's been around for 13.5 billion years. The Earth's been around for 4 billion years. Life has evolved during the last 1 billion years, and life evolved from very simple forms up to us. And so all this entire process may have occurred without any spiritual beings, without any intelligent creation whatsoever. Now, even if there was intelligent creation, even if there was an intelligent creator, that would not mean that any human religion was actually true. Because we don't know, we can't go back in time 13.5 billion years and watch the universe come into being and see what was happening there, see what made that happen. Whether it was just a purely physical, natural law event, or whether there was some intelligence there that caused it to happen. We can't go back 13.5 billion years because events that occurred in the past, that far back, are just like talking about supernatural beings now. They're unobservable. We cannot observe any non-physical beings that might exist at this very moment. And we cannot go back in time and observe things that happened 13.5 billion years ago. We can't even go back and observe things that happened 2,000 years ago. So, even if there were intelligent design, if there was some intelligent force that caused this amazingly beautiful world to come into existence and this incredibly complex and intricate thing we call life to come into existence, we still would not know anything about that intelligence that made it all come into being, except that it was intelligent enough to do it. But we wouldn't know anything about what kind of personality it had or what it wanted us to do. Okay? All of the religions of the earth have tried to imagine what the universe, the creator of the universe, might want us to do. But those imaginings are nothing but speculative guesses. And the speculative guesses of people who lived 2,000, 3,000 years ago are just as invalid as the speculative guesses we could make today. Only they would probably be more invalid because they knew so much less. We at least have a picture of a universe that's not only 13.5 billion years old, but has 400 billion galaxies in it. Not 400 billion stars. Each galaxy has billions of stars in it. And there are 400 billion galaxies in the universe. It's just enormous. So we can't have any, well, we living now and knowing the fact that there is a universe with 400 billion galaxies in it, would have to imagine a creative force that caused that to come into being that is so much more massive than anything that people could have imagined 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, when they still thought that the Earth was the only real planet, and that there was a solid firmament that surrounded it and God lived just beyond that. They lived in a tiny, tiny world or cosmos that was just so much smaller than what we now realize the universe is. So the speculations that people made 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, about the nature of whatever caused the universe to come into being are even less valid than the speculations we might have today. And we can speculate about the creator of the universe in any way we want. We could imagine, the way I imagine, that if there was a force that brought this world and all of it into being, I imagine it totally differently from the Christian God. I imagine a being that would want every living organism and its consciousness to live as happily as possible, to enjoy existence. Why bother to bring things into existence for any other reason than that you want those beings to enjoy their existence? And so my belief is that we are honoring the wishes of whatever brought the universe into being best when we are enjoying our consciousness, enjoying our life, enjoying our bodies, enjoying our sex drive, enjoying our orgasms as much as possible. I think that's what the universe would want us to be doing. But we have no way of knowing that. So the best thing for us to do is say, well, who knows what the universe wants us to do? Let's just decide for ourselves what we want to do and how we want to live our lives. Our lives belong to us. Our lives don't belong to any imaginary beings. Our lives belong to us. How do we want to live? What do we want to do? Do we want to be happy or unhappy? Well, obviously we want to be happy. Why do we want to be happy? Because our emotional brains enjoy it more when we're happy and our consciousness is happy. Our emotional brains enjoy it more. And they want happiness to continue, and they want happiness to be repeated. They want us to enjoy, our own emotional brains want us to enjoy life as much as we possibly can, all the time. And so that's why I started practicing what I call pleasure science 53 years ago, back in 1972. Actually, it's almost 54 years ago because this is 2026. So for well over half a century, Once I learned that there are specific exercises we can do to make ourselves feel better emotionally, that was like a revelation to me. And I've been practicing those exercises and inventing new ones and learning as many new ones as I can for the rest of my life. I've been doing that right up to the present. And I'm 77 now, and my body is more flexible than it was when I was 23 and I started doing pleasure science. And I've had tens of thousands, well, about 10,000 cosmic orgasms since then. I've spent 10,000 hours easily having super euphoric sex, which is something I learned about 3 years after I started doing pleasure science. And so I want to, before I kick the bucket, which could happen any day at my age, I want to try and pass on as much information as I can to whoever happens to be interested in living as happily as possible and having as much pleasure as possible. I want to pass on these techniques of pleasure science to you. And the first thing that we have to do, first thing that I had to do in my quest for pleasure, my quest for happiness, was to unlearn the chronic organismic tension running throughout my entire body, coming from my emotional brain and spreading out into my consciousness and down into my body, tensing up my muscles, agitating my internal organs, and giving my consciousness a rather unpleasant emotional tone or emotional flavor. The emotional flavor of my consciousness was basically not much flavor at all. If anything, sort of irritability, occasionally some good times, but then they would fade quickly. And my ongoing emotional flavor of consciousness was very limited, very flat, and or irritable, or anxious, frightened. I was very anxious. I got into despair very easily. I got into depression very easily. And what I didn't realize, and this is when I'm, let's say, 21, 22, round about there, what I didn't realize was that the habit of emotional tension and anxiety that I learned during my teenage years after my father convinced me, the minister convinced me, that masturbation was something God didn't like and that I was sinful if I masturbated and that I should try not to masturbate, which was like him saying, do as I say, not as I do. Because he was masturbating his whole life. He had a struggle with it and he could never stop masturbating. And yet he was telling me to stop at the age of 12, 13, and by that time I'd been masturbating for maybe, 4 to 6 months without any guilt at all and really enjoying the heck out of it. And then he poisoned that by telling me that God doesn't like it when we satisfy our own sex drive. And by making this seem like I was polluting my own body, which was supposed to be a temple inhabited by the Spirit of Jesus or the Holy Spirit or God, and that God couldn't cohabitate with sexual pleasure. For some reason, God is allergic to sexual pleasure. Jesus is allergic to sexual pleasure and doesn't like it and considers it a pollution. This is all imaginary speculation about imaginary beings that I unfortunately believed was true because I had been cognitively, emotionally molested and abused by my father from the age of 3.5 onwards. He kept penetrating my mind with delusional ideas about God so that I believed in the reality of God, I believed in the reality of Jesus, and I believed in the importance of pleasing them, even though they were imaginary beings I had never seen. But a child's mind is not only defenseless against delusional ideas, a child's mind is built evolutionarily. Evolution has built a child's mind to absorb like a sponge whatever our parents tell us. because that was a good way to keep children safe down through evolutionary time. If your parents warned you not to do something and you believed them and you didn't do it, that would keep you safe. Don't go down there where the tigers are going to get you and eat you. Don't cross the street without looking, or the cars are going to run you over. I mean, these are realistic ideas, realistic warnings that will help a child stay safe. So it's good that evolution has made the child's mind ready to believe anything that the adults tell the child, that the parents tell the child. That's usually a good thing, but parents abuse this native, natural tendency of the child's mind by filling the child full of bullshit, filling the child full of supernatural, metaphysical bullshit. Traditional bullshit, yeah. It's been believed for thousands of years, but guess what? Bullshit doesn't stop being bullshit. Bullshit doesn't stop being bullshit when it ages a certain time, okay? Bullshit stays bullshit. Any speculation about non-physical beings remains completely speculation, no matter how many billions of people have believed it, no matter how many centuries they have believed it for, it remains bullshit. It remains speculative guesses about the unknown that have never been proven true and cannot be proven true because we cannot talk to the beings who supposedly told us that masturbation was bad, okay? And yet, adults fill their children's minds with all this bullshit that has negative emotional effects on us. Because if we try, as I did, day after day, year after year, not to masturbate, and had an unsuccessful struggle with masturbation because I had already learned, I'd had already 4 to 6 months of my brain learning how wonderful orgasm is and how great masturbation is before my father ever decided to tell me that it wasn't, that it was something I should stop doing. My brain had already learned, my emotional brain had already learned how wonderful it is and wasn't going to stop doing it. And could not rest until it had experienced the pleasure of orgasm yet one more time. But then, immediately after the orgasm, of course, the orgasm shuts off the sex drive. So all of a sudden, I felt like, okay, I don't want sex anymore. I don't need sex anymore. And I feel terribly ashamed of the fact that I have failed to stop myself from having an orgasm. One more time, I have failed to stop myself from having an orgasm. I've been a failure again in the eyes of Jesus, in the eyes of God. I'm a bad person. I'm a poor, miserable sinner, just like my father felt, okay? He had passed on the emotional virus of being a poor, miserable sinner to me. He had infected me with his own fucking guilt about masturbation. Instead of having the guts to stand up against that irrational guilt and say, I think that's bullshit, Now, I was lucky. My father never had the counterculture. See, I graduated from high school in 1966, right when the counterculture was coming into full bloom. And the counterculture was all about pleasure is good, happiness is good, let's enjoy our lives, because when you take the psychedelics, when you take LSD or cannabis, all of a sudden you experience a much more light-filled consciousness. And I was able to see the world clearly through the fog of my own thoughts, which I hadn't realized was there and was always obscuring my view of the world. That fog was dissipated by LSD the first time I took it when I was 17 and 3/4. And I could see the beauty of the world was like my eyes were washed clean. It was like the doors of perception had been cleansed. Doors of perception being a quote from William Blake, the English poet of around 1800, used by Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, as the title of his book about taking mescaline, and how the doors of perception were cleansed. All of a sudden, I could see the world in all its beauty that I hadn't been able to see before, that I hadn't paid any attention to before. And now, all of a sudden, I could see it and just delight in the beauty of the world and delight in feeling a calm consciousness. And I couldn't remember feeling like that ever. Feeling actually calm inside, like everything's all right. I was so used to feeling anxious and guilty all the time, and feeling like there was something urgent that I needed to do that I wasn't doing, that I had no idea that that wasn't a normal way to be. It was normal for me. It was the way I always was, but I didn't realize that there was another way to be, a calm way to be. But that's where LSD took me, was it calmed me down completely. It totally calmed down my emotional brain, which it has done every time I've ever taken LSD. It has calmed down my emotional brain completely. Now that's my experience. Your experience may differ. Everybody's brain is different, and everybody's brain reacts to psychedelic chemicals differently. So I'm not saying you would feel the same, but that's how I felt. I felt completely calm. And I said, damn, I love being calm. This is wonderful. I don't ever want to come out of this wonderful experience. I had been afraid before that I would take LSD and never come back to normal reality. But once I took LSD and experienced the excuse me, little natural reflex there. Once I had taken LSD and discovered the wonderfulness of being calm, I didn't want to leave that at all. I didn't want to go back to my normal way of being. But eventually the chemical wears off and you do go back to your normal way of being. And I would get high on cannabis after that. And sometimes I would have bad trips on cannabis because cannabis isn't as powerful a psychedelic as LSD. It doesn't act in quite the same way. For me, LSD calmed me down always, no matter what. Even when I was trying to freak myself out, LSD would calm me down. It was that strong a tranquilizer for my emotional brain. But cannabis wasn't like that. I could get off on weird trips in my head and think about, God and religion and the devil and all kinds of crazy shit. And so I would have some bad trips on cannabis sometimes, but I would also have some great trips on cannabis. It was very unpredictable. Eventually, when I learned the first pleasure science techniques that I learned, I found that it is possible to relax oneself, to change the way our emotional brain operates. My emotional brain was operating in anxiety mode as the default mode all the time. And once I started doing physical relaxation exercises, loosening up my muscles, some nice deep breathing, and learning how to quiet down the activity in my mind with Zen meditation, once I was able to do that, I started being able to change the way that my emotional brain operated and shift the default mode from anxiety to calmness. And then cannabis started to be really good. Once I learned how to do Zen meditation, cannabis became a lot more fun because I was having problems with cannabis because my thought stream, the stream of images going through my consciousness all the time, was not under my control. I had no control over it. And I could get myself started on a kind of paranoid way of thinking, a whole paranoid series of thoughts, and I would get freaked out and more freaked out and more freaked out. And I was just freaking myself out. And there wasn't anything bad actually happening. I'll tell you a story. I was up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, in the summer of 1967. I'd gone up there to spend the summer with a guy from my hometown who was living up there. And the first day or two that I got there and was staying with him, he received a little package from some friends back in California where we both lived. And it was a little book, I guess, wrapped in brown paper. And along the spine of the book, there was a joint, a cannabis joint in there. See, now in 1967, cannabis was still so against the law. It was very hard to get. And to even get one joint was a big deal for Rand, my friend, and myself. So, we opened up the package and boy, we were going to smoke this. We went ahead and smoked the joint. It was great shit, And Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had just come out. That album had just been released, and we were both listening to it for the first time. And it was just blowing our minds. Here we were high on cannabis, listening to Sgt. Pepper's. And then I got to thinking about the package that he'd gotten through the mail. And it had to come through international customs, you see, from the United States to Canada. And I remembered that there was a hole poked in the brown paper that the little book and the joint were wrapped in. The customs agent or somebody had stuck their finger in there and pierced the paper. And I began to think, what if they realized that there was a joint of cannabis in that package? And they went ahead and sent it on to us, sent it on to Rand, my friend, so that they could come bust him after he'd gotten it. And I suddenly thought, God, what if the Canadian police are going to come in here and bust us right now for smoking this joint because they know that it was delivered to us in the mail today? And I went on this whole paranoid trip about that. And I was getting more and more panicky about it. And just then, the final cut in the Sgt. Pepper's album, A Day in the Life, started playing. And at the end of it, if you recall, if you've listened to that song, there's this big orchestra swirl of sound. It's not even really music anymore. It's just this rum, rum, rum. And it starts going up in volume, up and up and up and up and up, and getting more and more and more and more intense. And it was just agitating my emotional brain, which was already in a state of anxiety from these paranoid thoughts. It just got me more and more agitated. I had to actually leave the house and run outside and get away from the music because it was making me so freaked out. So that was the kind of experience that I would have on cannabis. And it wasn't until I learned how to do Zen meditation, which is basically mind-clearing meditation, learning how to suspend the stream of thoughts completely for short periods of time. And if you learn to do it, even for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, what that does is it interrupts that stream of consciousness. It interrupts that stream of thoughts that are flowing through your mind that you haven't really chosen, but that your emotional brain has projected into your mind. Oh gosh, they're going to come and bust us for this cannabis, and I'm going to be thrown in jail here in Canada. I'll never get home. Anyway, once you learn how to stop those thoughts, then it becomes obvious that thoughts are not things. Thoughts are just thoughts. Thoughts are not reality. Thoughts are thoughts. And I learned that the thoughts I think will affect my emotional mood. For instance, thinking thoughts that I'm going to get busted by the police when there's no police in sight. There's no reason to think that they're going to be there except for that little hole in the package. But even though they weren't there, I was panicking as though they were there. But after I learned how to do Zen meditation, then I could realize, oh, Steve, you're just freaking yourself out. with paranoid thoughts. And that's having a negative effect on your emotional brain and your emotional responses. Because when you do Zen meditation, you learn how to recognize the flavor, the emotional flavor that your emotional brain is putting into your consciousness. And if that flavor is anxiety, you can say, oh, wow, I'm thinking these thoughts, and the thoughts are freaking out my emotional brain, and my emotional brain is making me feel this emotional flavor of anxiety in consciousness. And yet, what I'm thinking about is not actually happening. Let me just stop thinking about that shit. And let me just focus on what's happening right here, right now. Okay, Rand and I are here. We're listening to music, okay? And eventually I learned how to, it's not easy, but you can learn how to distance yourself from music that's playing so that it doesn't affect you so much emotionally, particularly if you've practiced being calm. I could listen to that same track, A Day in the Life. I could listen to that same cut on the album, and now I could stay calm as I listen to it. I could objectify the music. It's an object out there. I don't have to let it affect me emotionally. I can just observe it as a phenomenon, something that's happening. And I can see that music going up. I can feel that music going up and all of that stuff. And I don't have to let it make me anxious at all. In fact, if I wanted to, I could just ride it up and enjoy riding it up. Imagine lifting up and going on some kind of a ride that's lifting me high into the sky, and enjoy the music instead. Pleasure science gives us more control over our consciousness and over what is happening emotionally in our consciousness. And that's why it's so important for us to learn, particularly if we have had a Christian upbringing, and a Christian upbringing has caused us to develop habits of anxiety or anger or fear or sadness. Whatever the emotional habit is, we can unlearn that. It no longer has to be our default mode. We can say, okay, I'm feeling kind of depressed. All right, I'm going to do some exercises. I'm going to get my body feeling better. I'm going to go outside, enjoy the day, take some deep breathing, and really look around, be calm, and look around at the world. Being calm is an emotional habit that we need to form by practicing it repeatedly. And so I call this transcendental relaxation, because it's transcendental, because to transcend means to rise above something else. Transcendental relaxation lifts us above our normal state of consciousness and allows us to be calm. We feel a sense of transcendental calm that surpasses our ordinary consciousness. And eventually, once I learned how to do this, then cannabis becomes a great help, because as long as we're not freaking ourselves out with our own thoughts, as long as we're not doing that, cannabis has a natural anti-anxiety effect. It has a natural effect of calming down the anxiety-producing center of our emotional brain, the amygdala. And it calms down the anxiety circuits coming out from the amygdala to the rest of our body. And so when the amygdala calms down, and cannabis helps that happen, and we practice deliberately, intentionally being calm, then we can have a really wonderful transcendental relaxation consciousness, where we are calm, and yet we're very aware of the world, and cannabis can sharpen our perceptions and make it actually more delightful. All the pleasant experiences of life become more delightful on cannabis, once we've learned how to be calm and not freak ourselves out with thoughts of anxiety. All right, well, that's probably enough for today. Remember, if you want a detailed summary or outline of the talk today, you can go to the video description box below the video in YouTube Click on the link there. It will take you to a Google document page. You can go file, print, and print out a summary of the talk today that has been generated by AI. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.